Ethan stepped through the front door of his small but comfortable home, a modern townhouse nestled in a busy street in the heart of New York City. It had been another grueling day at work, and all he wanted was to relax on the couch with a cold drink. But as soon as he set foot inside, a strange sense of unease settled over him. The air felt heavy, almost as if it was charged with static. He glanced around, noticing that the throw pillows on his couch were slightly off-center. The mail he had left on the kitchen counter the previous day was now scattered on the dining table, and the remote control was no longer where he left it. At first, he dismissed these oddities as his own forgetfulness. After all, he had been working late hours and was probably too tired to remember small details. But as the evening wore on, the unsettling feeling grew stronger. It wasn't just the misplaced objects, it was as if the very walls were watching him. That night, as he tried to fall asleep, the sound of faint footsteps echoed down the hallway. He shot up in bed, his heart racing. Grabbing his phone, he cautiously made his way out of the bedroom, but the house was empty, or so it seemed. The next few days passed in a blur of work and worry. Ethan tried to brush off the strange occurrences as nothing more than his imagination running wild. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was in his house. At night, the footsteps returned, louder this time, accompanied by faint whispers. It was always the same time, 2:33 a.m. sharp. Ethan would wake up, hear the sounds, and find no one there. His sleep became restless, and soon his exhaustion from work was compounded by sleepless nights filled with dread. One evening, after another sleepless night, Ethan sat in his living room, sipping coffee and trying to stay awake. As he stared at the flickering TV, something in the corner of his eye caught his attention. A shadow, quick, darting across the hallway. Ethan jumped up and rushed to the hallway, but again, there was nothing. Shaken, he realized this was no ordinary haunting. Something was in his house, and it was getting bolder. Ethan decided it was time to take action. The disturbances were becoming too frequent and too real to ignore. After a particularly unsettling night filled with distant laughter and objects moving on their own, he resolved to check every room in the house. He had to know if someone, or something, was hiding there. He began his search room by room, but everything seemed in order, until he reached the basement. He had hardly gone down there since moving in. It was mostly a storage space, cluttered with old boxes and furniture he rarely used. As he tried to open the door, he noticed something strange. It was locked. A knot formed in his stomach. He didn't remember ever locking the door, and as far as he knew, it couldn't be locked from the inside. Yet no matter how much he jiggled the knob or pushed against the door, it wouldn't budge. "What the hell?" he muttered, stepping back. The door looked solid, but there was something eerie about it now, something he hadn't noticed before. He felt an overwhelming urge to leave it alone, but his curiosity outweighed his fear. He grabbed his tools and forced the door open, the wood creaking ominously as it gave way. The basement was pitch black, and as he reached for the light switch, his hand brushed against something cold. The light flickered on, casting a dim glow over the cluttered space below. But nothing seemed out of place. Just old furniture, dusty shelves, and forgotten boxes. Yet, as he descended the stairs, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. The air was stale, yet something felt freshly disturbed, like the dust hadn't fully settled. That night, the footsteps were louder than ever, and Ethan could no longer deny it. Someone, or something, was living in his house. By now, Ethan was on edge. Every creak in the floorboards made his skin crawl, and every whisper in the dark felt like it was getting closer. He couldn't live like this anymore. He had to find out what was going on. So he installed security cameras throughout the house, determined to catch whatever or whoever was causing the disturbances. He waited anxiously for the next night, barely sleeping, his eyes fixed on his phone, which was connected to the cameras. When the sounds returned at 2:33 a.m., as they always did, he reviewed the footage immediately. His heart nearly stopped. There, in the dim glow of the hallway camera, were faint figures moving through the house. At first, it was hard to make out, but after rewinding the footage several times, he saw it clearly. Shadows, moving with purpose, as if they belonged there. But no intruder had entered the house. No doors had been unlocked or opened. It was as if the figures had simply appeared out of nowhere. Ethan's hand shook as he watched the footage again. These weren't burglars or squatters. This was something far more terrifying. He was living with ghosts. The next night, Ethan tried to stay calm. He told himself he would face whatever was in his house and finally get some answers. He didn't have to wait long. Just after midnight, while sitting in his living room, he heard the faint sound of laughter again. This time, though, it was louder, clearer, and coming from directly behind him. He turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. There, sitting at the dining table, was a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children, all smiling as if they had been there all along. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Who are you?" he stammered, backing away from the sight before him. The family didn't seem startled by his presence. In fact, they looked at him as if he was the intruder. "We live here," the man said calmly, taking a sip from a cup Ethan knew had been empty moments ago. "We always have." Ethan couldn't believe what he was hearing. "What are you talking about? This is my house. I've lived here for 5 years." The woman smiled, shaking her head gently. "No, dear, we've been here much longer." Ethan blinked, unsure if he was dreaming or if he had lost his mind. But the family looked so real, so solid, and they spoke with such conviction that he began to question his own reality. How could they believe this was their home? The days that followed were filled with confusion. Ethan tried to understand how this family had appeared in his house, insisting they had lived there all along. They seemed so certain, so convinced that this was their home, yet there was no record of them. He asked questions, but the family's answers only left him more bewildered. They knew things about the house that he didn't. The way the pipes rattled in winter, a loose floorboard in the upstairs hallway, even a hidden compartment in the wall behind the fireplace that Ethan had never noticed. How could they know these things? How could they be so familiar with the home, yet he had never seen or heard of them before? As the days turned into weeks, Ethan found himself trapped in a bizarre cohabitation with the family. They acted as though everything was normal, going about their daily lives, using his furniture, eating his food, watching his television, all while Ethan watched in stunned silence, unsure of how to make sense of the situation. Desperate for answers, Ethan began researching the history of his home. He reached out to his real estate agent, contacted local authorities, and scoured public records, but there was no mention of the family in any official documents. As far as the city was concerned, no one had lived in the house before Ethan bought it. When he told his friends about the family, they looked at him with concern, some suggesting he see a therapist. But Ethan knew what he had seen. He wasn't imagining things. The family was real, and they were in his house. Frustrated and alone, Ethan began to wonder if he would ever uncover the truth. But the deeper he dug, the more questions he found, and the more unsettling the situation became. How could a family exist within his house without anyone knowing? Soon, the family's presence became an unshakable part of Ethan's life. They were always there, cooking breakfast in the kitchen, watching movies in the living room, even tucking the children into bed in the guest room. They never seemed to sleep or leave the house. Ethan felt like a stranger in his own home, an unwelcome guest in what was supposed to be his safe space. The family was friendly enough, but there was always a sense of underlying tension, as if they were waiting for something, watching him carefully. One night, after yet another sleepless evening filled with footsteps and laughter, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at the family as they ate dinner. The food smelled real, the clink of silverware sounded normal, but it all felt wrong. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice trembling. The family didn't answer Ethan's question. Instead, they continued to eat as though he hadn't spoken at all. Frustrated and desperate, Ethan left the kitchen and stormed toward the basement. He had to know what was down there, what might explain this madness. As he reached the basement door, he noticed it was slightly ajar, the same door that had been locked tight only a few days before. Cautiously, he descended the stairs, each step creaking beneath his weight. The dim light from the basement bulb barely illuminated the space, but something was different now. The clutter he had noticed before was gone, and in its place was a strange sense of order, as if the basement had been recently cleaned. As he ventured further in, His eyes fell on a small, wooden chest tucked away in the corner. It wasn't there before, or had he simply missed it? He knelt down and opened the chest, the creak of the wood echoing eerily in the quiet basement. Inside were old photographs, faded and yellowed with age. The photos showed a family standing proudly in front of his house, the same family that was currently living in it. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he flipped through the images. They were wearing clothes from decades ago, but their faces were unmistakable. The father, the mother, the two children. They looked exactly the same as they did now, unchanged by time. Among the photos was a newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Family dies in tragic house fire, bodies never recovered." Ethan's hands trembled as he read the article. The date was from over 50 years ago, yet here they were, alive and well in his home. Ethan couldn't believe what he was seeing. How could this family be both alive and dead? He rushed upstairs with the photos in hand, determined to confront them once and for all. But when he reached the living room, the family was gone. Panicked, he searched the entire house, calling out their names, but there was no response. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The house was eerily silent, the familiar sounds of footsteps and laughter now replaced with an oppressive stillness. Just as Ethan was about to give up, the father appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, his expression unreadable. "We didn't want you to find out this way," the father said softly, stepping into the room. "But now that you know, there's no going back." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you? Are you ghosts?" The father nodded solemnly. "In a way, we died here many years ago, but for some reason, we never left. This house has been our home ever since." Ethan backed away, shaking his head. "This is impossible. You're sitting here, eating, living. How can you be dead?" The father smiled sadly. "We don't know why we're still here, but we are. And we're tied to this house. As long as it stands, so do we." Ethan sat down, his mind racing as he tried to comprehend the impossible. The family, John, his wife, and their children, had been living in the house for decades after their deaths, trapped in some strange limbo between life and death. "Why me?" Ethan asked, staring at John. "Why now? I've been living here for years. Why didn't you reveal yourselves before?" John sighed, glancing toward his wife, who had silently entered the room with their children. "We've always been here, watching, waiting. But something about you, your energy, your presence, it woke us. We couldn't remain hidden any longer." Ethan's pulse quickened. "What do you mean woke you?" John's face grew grim. "We're not just tied to the house, Ethan. We're tied to you." A cold dread settled over Ethan as he realized the truth. His presence in the house had reawakened the family's connection to the living world. They hadn't just been haunting the house, they had been waiting for him. As the days passed, Ethan's life became unbearable. The family's presence was no longer just an eerie mystery, it was a constant reminder of the impossible situation he found himself in. They were always there, watching him, following his every move. The house no longer felt like his own. He tried to go about his daily life, but the family's existence weighed heavily on him. Their laughter, once faint, became louder, more intrusive. Their interactions, once benign, started to feel more hostile. The children would leave toys scattered across the floor, and John would stare at Ethan with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Ethan's friends stopped visiting, convinced he was losing his mind. His work began to suffer as sleepless nights took their toll. And worst of all, the family seemed to be growing more aggressive, as though they were no longer content to simply coexist. One evening, after another tense day, Ethan snapped. "You need to leave," he shouted at John, who stood by the window, watching the city below. "This is my house. You can't just stay here forever." John turned slowly, his expression dark. "We've been here long before you, Ethan. You're the one who's intruding." Desperate for a way to rid himself of the family, Ethan reached out to a paranormal investigator, a man named Marcus who had a reputation for dealing with cases of hauntings. Marcus was intrigued by Ethan's story and agreed to visit the house to investigate. When Marcus arrived, he immediately sensed the presence of the family. He performed rituals and set up equipment, attempting to communicate with the spirits. After hours of investigation, he sat down with Ethan, his face pale. I've dealt with hauntings before, Marcus said quietly, but this is different. They are not just ghosts, Ethan. They are tethered to you, to your family. Ethan stared at him in disbelief. What are you talking about? Marcus explained that the family's spirits were bound to Ethan's bloodline. His great-grandfather had once owned the house, and the tragedy that had claimed the family's lives had been caused, in part, by his ancestors' negligence. Ethan's mind reeled as he processed Marcus's words. The family's fate had been tied to his own for generations. The fire that killed them had been started by a faulty gas line. A gas line his great-grandfather had neglected to fix, despite knowing it was dangerous. They don't just haunt this house, Marcus explained. They haunt your family. You are the reason they can't move on. Ethan felt sick to his stomach. The weight of his ancestors' guilt now rested on his shoulders. But how could he atone for a crime committed long before he was born? Is there a way to free them? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus shook his head. I don't know. The bond is deep. As long as you live here, they will be here with you. Ethan realized there was no escaping the family. They were tied to him, to his blood, and there was no way to break the connection. The house had become a prison, not just for the family, but for Ethan as well. The family's presence became more oppressive with each passing day. They no longer bothered to hide their disdain for him. The children would knock things over, whispering in his ear when he tried to sleep. John and his wife would stare at him with cold, accusing eyes. One night, Ethan stood in front of the mirror, exhausted and defeated. He knew now that the family wasn't going anywhere. They were a part of his life, whether he liked it or not. As he stared into his reflection, he saw John standing behind him, his eyes filled with anger. This is our home, John whispered, his voice low and threatening, and we're never leaving. Ethan closed his eyes, accepting the truth. The house was theirs now, and he was the intruder.